Good afternoon, class. I'm so sorry I'm unable to be with you today physically, but this is Group 1 making a presentation on the topic Social Exclusion and Vulnerability. The group comprises of Tony Ayine, Moses Ogwa, and Daniel Stephen, myself. In this topic, we will be looking at the conditions of vulnerability and exclusions and the underlying causes. Objective number 2 would be to link vulnerability, exclusion, and poverty and the quest for proper policies. Our third objective with this presentation is to give approaches to official recognition of vulnerability and exclusion in both the formal and informal context of leadership practice, and our final objective is helping you to understand vulnerability and exclusion and how it has shaped social policy in the different parts of the world as we know it today. Vulnerability is quite a complex subject to discuss. Vulnerability can be challenging to understand because it tends to mean different things to different people, and because it is often described using a variety of terms, including predisposition, fragility, weakness, deficiency, or lack of capacity, the understanding has even become more complex in our current dispensation. Some definitions of vulnerability have included exposure in addition to susceptibility to harm. However, it is now understood that exposure is separate to the susceptibility element of vulnerability, since it is possible to be exposed to something whilst at the same time not susceptible to natural hazards. So it has gone beyond the discourse of just being exposed to harm or being susceptible to natural disaster. Despite some divergence over the meaning of vulnerability, most experts agree that understanding vulnerability requires more than analyzing the direct impact of a hazard. Vulnerability also concerns, in some respects, a wider environmental and social condition that limits people and communities to cope with the impact of hazard when it happens, and this is according to Bigman 2006. Vulnerability is not simply about poverty, but extensive research over the past 30 years or so has revealed that it is generally the poor who tend to suffer more or the worst from disasters when they happen. Poverty is both a driver and a consequence of disaster risks, especially in countries with weak governance structures, because economic pressure forces people to live in unsafe location and conditions. Poverty and the other multidimensional factors and drivers that create vulnerability mean that susceptibility to the impacts of hazard is often, but not always, associated with certain groups, including women, children, the elderly, the disabled, migrants, displaced populations, among so many other categories of people we could mention. According to DFID, vulnerability is defined as a name given to a set of characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that makes it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. So, whatever would put people in a place where they are prone to experiencing some form of hazard is vulnerability. The concept vulnerability is derived from the Latin word vulnus, which also means wound. Its epistemology signifies the human potential to be wounded. So, that is, to experience physical trauma. In modern usage, that is in our current dispensation, the notion refers to both physical and psychological harm. It indicates human exposure to psychological harm, moral damage, or spiritual threats. Vulnerability more generally includes our ability to suffer psychologically, morally, spiritually, rather than simply a physical capacity for pain. So a flood happens in a district like Bududa. Flood happens. They're vulnerable to floods or susceptible to floods. So when it happens, it's not just about the physical effect or the physical damage that the flood causes that is vulnerability. It includes both the psychological, the moral, and the spiritual bit of the trauma people go through when they face such kind of difficulties. Our common human vulnerability, as illustrated by morbidity and mortality, can be regarded as the basis for shared human rights, such as the right to life itself. Vulnerability research covers a range of complex fields, such as political ecology, security studies, disaster and risk management. So really, vulnerability crosses across diverse range of sectors when you look at it critically. Social vulnerability, on the other hand, alludes to the failure of an individual or group to contradict negative circumstances or effects. So a group of people are intentionally neglected from a service which they rightfully deserve or they are rightfully entitled to. This can be alluded to as stressors. Stressors incorporate social exclusion, different types of misuse, and regular calamities. Sociologists explain that social vulnerability exists because of structural factors. Social vulnerability alludes to the powerlessness of an individual or group to contradict negative circumstances, like I said before. The concept of social exclusion originated in France about 30 years ago. Then the term was mostly used as something to describe individuals who were not covered by the social security systems of that time. This included single mothers, substance abusers or drug addicts, sex workers, people with special needs, like I refer to them most times. And over time, this grew to also include the unemployed, the homeless, dissatisfied youth, the old, immigrants, and so on. In analyzing the evolution of social exclusion, Saracino in 2001 notes that the conceptual shift implies a change in perspective from a static to a dynamic approach. That is, from one-dimensional to a multi-dimensional and distributional or relational focus. In the late 1990s, the UK Labour government put a spotlight on the term social exclusion as social inclusion, because the opposite of social exclusion is social inclusion. And by incorporating these concepts into their manifesto, Tony Blair's government defines social exclusion as a shorthand term for what can happen when people or poor areas suffer from a combination of linked problems. These linked problems could be unemployment, poor skills, low income, poor housing, or even high crime rates and inability to access good health services. Several scholars have different definition of social exclusion if we want to review the available literatures that are available. But one that is particularly interesting is Bell and Piron, 2005. They both define social exclusion as a process and a state that derives from exclusionary relationship based on power, and one that prevents individuals or a collection of group of people from asserting their rights and their full participation in some dimension, which one dimension is economic life. So people are excluded from the labor market, the employment market, enterprise opportunities, which could serve as, not could, but which is the source of livelihood for most people. They're excluded from it. The other dimension is the social life. People are excluded from access to infrastructure and services, social security, protection, public safety and social cohesion. And the last dimension is the political affairs. People being restricted from access to organization, decision-making process, especially when it comes to looking at this issue from a gender lens, and the rights and responsibility of citizenship. It is therefore the interconnections between exclusion from the economy, politics, and social participation that influences on equal power relation and general exclusions from organization, institutions, and social life as we experienced today in most of our African countries. Jeremy 2001 notes social exclusion is considered as an exclusive or elusive concept difficult to measure, although the concept has been helpful in enriching social policy discourse across the world. Social exclusion can also be seen as the process of marginalizing individuals or groups of a particular society. It could be that the Twa group in Uganda excluded from some kind of services, or if we look at Karamoja in the north, where some government services are enjoyed in the capital but are not extended to places like Karamoja. We have a diagram for which I believe my colleague Tony and Moses will show to you in classroom that basically talks about social exclusion and how it relates to the different spheres of development activity. You have on one end the exclusion from economy, you have from the other end the exclusion from social participation, and you have on the other end the exclusion from politics. Let's now move further into specifically discussing social vulnerability. What is this concept, social vulnerability? In its broadest sense, as we agreed before, that vulnerability refers to being exposed to harm or attack, a situation where a person is unable to protect his or herself. And when speaking of vulnerability, there are different types of vulnerability. Vulnerability, like we agreed in the early introduction of this presentation, that it has a very diverse meaning to very different group of people. It could be social, cognitive, or military vulnerability. But let's focus on the social vulnerability bit of it. Social vulnerability refers to the inability of an individual or community to oppose negative situations or impact. In other words, I, as Daniel Steven, am incapacitated to take actions that would negate some effects that I do not want on my life. This can be referred to as stressors, as we agreed before. Sociologists highlight that social vulnerability mainly exists due to structural factors such as social inequality, where one group has more upper hand or more access to the decision-making process than another, or different contexts. Although a person may be able to break away from such a condition, it persists for the majority. Some people have been able to break out of that circle where they are no longer socially vulnerable, but the majority of people, especially in Uganda, still face some level of vulnerability. There are two models that are used to calculate how vulnerable a person or a community is. They are the risk hazard model and the pressure release model. The risk hazard model was created to comprehend the impact of a hazard and the sensitivity of those who were exposed to the event, while the second model of pressure release model analyzes the progression of vulnerability. In other words, how does it move from step 1 to 2 down to the final step in the vulnerability process. Having given that background to this presentation, let's now go to some of our objectives in this presentation. What are the conditions for vulnerability and exclusion, and what are the underlying causes for vulnerability? The conditions or characteristics are either physical, social, economic, and environmental that increases one's chances of getting to a place of vulnerability or making you susceptible to vulnerability as either an individual or a community or a system. Vulnerability is the human dimension of disaster. and is the result of a range of economic, social, cultural, institutional, political, psychological factors that people that shape people's life and the environment they live in. Let's discuss these factors individually that leads to vulnerability. The first factor is the physical factors. The physical factors are things that really have a direct impact on our lives. Like for instance, somebody is given a job as an architect to construct a building for a family, and he does not go through the nitty-gritties of making sure that the material used to build such kind of structure is lasting. It makes the people to become vulnerable because of the poor design or poor attention paid to details by the architecture. The second factor is the social factor. Social factor like issues of poverty, inequality. For instance, we would all agree that one gender, the female gender, over time in history has been disadvantaged in the past. So a lot of women empowerment programs these days are trying to bring them to a level where they are par with men. I know some of you would have some questions, but we would discuss that after our whole presentation. The third factor is the economic factor. Most of our businesses in Africa are in the informal sector and they are uninsured. So anything that happens in the market, say fluctuation of price or inflation, it affects them directly, and their source of livelihood is just cut short like that, making them vulnerable. The last factor is the environmental factor. Poor environmental management can result in catastrophic disaster, like in the instance of Bududa or the recent flood mudslide in, I can't recall the place. Tony will help me with the name of that place. There was a mudslide there, wiping away some people who would have contributed greatly to the development of Uganda. There are some other factors which also causes vulnerability, which we would not look into due to time. But we have the historical, political, cultural, institutional, and other causes of for vulnerability. But however, many of the underlying drivers are increasing, resulting in vulnerability. We do not have in place sustainable mechanisms to cushion the effects of this vulnerability. Why does understanding vulnerability, why does it matter? Why is it important? By including our understanding of vulnerability in disaster risk, we acknowledge the fact that disaster risk not only depends on the severity of hazard or the number of people and assets exposed, but that it is also a reflection of the susceptibility of people and economic assets to suffer loss. Excuse me. The different levels of vulnerability and exposure helps to explain why some non-extreme hazard can lead to extreme impacts and disaster, while some extreme events do not at all. How do we measure vulnerability? We talked about two models up there, but let's see other models of measuring this multidimensional concept known as vulnerability. There's no one single method of assessing vulnerability that we must have at the back of our mind. Ideally, any assessment should adopt a holistic approach to assessing this issue. In reality, methods are usually divided into those that consider physical or built environment vulnerability and those that consider the socio-economic vulnerability. When you look at assessing the vulnerability of the built environment to hazard, that's the physical, it is extremely important in assessing the potential consequences of an event and ensuring that it is mainstream into disaster risk reduction. in the local development planning process of any society, especially at the LC1 level in Uganda, and understanding the response of existing structures to potential hazards such as ground shaking from earthquake and wind from tropical cyclones requires the knowledge of building materials and engineering practice. Local engineers are increasingly dedicating themselves to understanding the vulnerability of their local building stock. So it is very important that every profession prepares their people to understand how vulnerability can affect them. Efforts to quantify socioeconomic vulnerability, which is the second way of measuring vulnerability and poverty, remain limited, and information of this kind is rarely integrated into risk assessment. Quantifying social vulnerability remains a challenge, but indicators and indices to measure vulnerability have been created, both quantitative and qualitative, ranging from global indicators to those that are applied at the community level. These indicators are usually used to track changes in vulnerability over a period of time. Qualitative approaches to vulnerability assessment are focused on the assessment of the capacity of community to cope with natural events that happen, like flooding, lack of rainfall, or change in climates as we are currently seeing and experiencing with our farmers. And vulnerability analysis involves understanding the root causes of the drivers. At the community level, a number of researchers and humanitarians and non-governmental organizations have measured vulnerability primarily through participatory method. A wide range of environmental, economic, social, cultural, and institutional pressure that creates vulnerability is incorporated into this participatory method. Social exclusion and vulnerability are two related concepts between which a key difference can be discerned. Social exclusion refers to the process of marginalizing individuals or groups from full participation in various social, economic, and political activities, while social vulnerability refers to the inability of an individual or community to oppose negative situations or impacts. The relationship between this concept is that social exclusion can lead people to social vulnerability. It operates as a stressor that creates vulnerability in groups and in individuals. At this junction, allow me to please pause and allow my colleague Tony and Moses to continue with objectives 2, 3, and 4. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. God bless you.